because we are dealing with new technologies, emerging technologies, and we haven't had the opportunity necessarily to think through or to identify all of the potential consequences of those technologies. There are some real challenges for regulators in deciding what it is that we need to do about the law as it impacts the way that we use these technologies or the way that we roll them out. So all the way through this course, we're going to be discussing questions of responsibility and liability. So these are concepts that we'll dig into a bit further as we come into coming weeks. But before we start, I want us to take a high-level view and think about when do we need to have a law? When do we need to regulate an activity? And how do we make sure that we're doing that well? Whose responsibility is it? So basically asking ourselves the question, what makes a good law? What makes law good? What's an example of good regulation or good legislation? So there are a couple of jurisprudential concepts. So jurisprudence is essentially the study of the philosophy of law. And there are a couple of concepts that we need to think through here when it comes to thinking particularly about AI. And I'm going to start with, I'm going to talk about the following three. Asimov's three laws of robotics. Okay, not really a jurisprudential concept as such, but it's a useful starting place because a lot of what we have to do in this idea, or dealing with these ideas about how robots and artificial intelligence, for example, or these emerging technologies need to be regulated, requires us to think, what will these technologies do? And we borrow quite a lot from popular fiction and popular culture in doing so. But the two main concepts I want to spend our time with are Lawrence Lessig's concept or theory that code is law. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And we're going to use the work of an American jurisprudence scholar, Lon L. Fuller, who really looked at the question of the morality of law. Now, we could look at a lot of different people. We could look at Dworkin, we could look at any of the ancient philosophers, but for now, we're going to stick with these three, and I think that they give us a good framework as we keep asking questions as we move forward. So before we even get to the law, though, we've got to ask ourselves some questions about whether or not we're talking about the right thing. Many of the questions you can ask in this course will ask you about the legal and ethical considerations. So it's worth actually thinking about, well, what are the similarities and differences between these two things? In a nutshell, when we're talking about the law, we're referring to a system of rules or regulations that are enforced by government institutions. So courts, law enforcement agencies like the police or armies or the sheriff, or regulators like ASIC or the ACCC or the Australian Tax Office. Laws are established to maintain order, to protect the rights that individuals have, and to give us a framework for resolving disputes. On the other hand, ethics, when we refer to ethics as opposed to law, we're talking about a set of moral principles or values that will guide individual behaviour and decision making. Ethics aren't necessarily enforced by legal systems. Instead, they're sort of shaped by societal norms, by cultural values, and of course, personal beliefs. We can talk about people as being ethical people, even though their values might be completely different from ours. It's a very individual thing, and ethics vary across culture and context. So what might be ethical in one situation might be unethical or considered unethical in another. In the context of business, laws typically dictate what actions are legal or illegal, while ethics will guide what actions are morally right and morally wrong. So let's use an example. A company might be legally allowed to exploit a loophole in the tax code to minimise their tax burden, but it might not be considered the right thing to do. It might be legally okay, but it might be seen as ethically not okay. So we'll see this kind of issue arise quite a bit when we dive into, for example, the laws in relation to privacy in Australia. And whilst we look at what AI and big data in particular can do to predict people's behaviours and to analyse and learn things about individuals, in fact, it may well be doing that without ever breaking any privacy principles because it doesn't use personal information. So it might be legally fine to do these things. It might be ethically murky. And again, whether you think it's ethically murky or not will depend on your values, your cultural situation, and the context, of course. Um, so let's think about, sorry, let me just have a quick look at my notes. Another example, AI-powered facial recognition. So think about a system that might be used by a company to identify potential customers for targeted advertising. From a legal standpoint, clearly the company using technology like this needs to comply with data privacy laws. Depending on where it is, if it's in Europe, for example, it might need to comply with the GDPR. It might need to comply with American standards. And again, how it works in practice is it tends to be the technologies will adhere quite often to the strictest set of standards in the markets in which they operate, because it doesn't make sense to have different standards in different places. And basically that means the company using this technology or deploying this technology needs to understand the laws that govern how it can collect, store, and use personal data, including facial images, in the different places where it's going to do that. So it needs to ensure that its facial recognition system is collecting and processing the data in a way that complies with relevant laws. It can do that, but at the same time, it might also, from an ethical standpoint, think about the issues or the concerns that its customers, users might have about discrimination or bias or predicting what their behaviours might be. Even though it might not be a breach of their personal information, they might have customers who feel like it's an invasion of their privacy. So, for example, the AI system may not be equally accurate in recognising individuals of different races or genders, leading to biases in the targeted advertising, or the collection and the storage of facial images without their consent of individuals might be considered to be a violation of privacy. These are often not legal issues, but ethical issues. So whilst the use of this AI-powered facial recognition might be legal, at the same time, it's going to be important for the companies to consider the ethical implications of its use. That might include ensuring the technology is accurate and unbiased and obtaining individuals' consent for the collection and storage of their faces or images of their faces. And this might help the company to ensure that it's acting in both a legal and ethical way. So we'll keep coming back to this, and I want you to continually be asking yourself, just because I've got the right to do it, doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. Keep having to ask that. So basically thinking about what the responsibilities are, what the liabilities are of robots has been around for a really long time. One of my favourite science fiction authors when I was a kid is a guy called Isaac Asimov. He wrote the Foundation trilogy. He was a prolific basically starting in the late-ish 1940s, and he was still writing well into his old age in the 1970s. Many of his writings are somewhat dated now. Turned out he was a serial sex pest and probably not a very nice person, but he certainly wrote a lot of science fiction that this particular nerd really enjoyed when I was a kid. And ultimately, he set up a framework for the robots in his story, robots usually being humanoid forms of artificial intelligence. They'll talk about in the next slide. Sorry, got distracted by something. How unlike me. Um, there are lots of industries when we think about it. Tobacco, automotive, nuclear. None of those at the very beginning started thinking we need to have lots of safety features in place. Every single one of those industries has resisted externally imposed safeguards. And none has ever accepted an absolute edict against ever causing harm to humans. Uh, so it is quite common for an industry that is excited about the deployment of its new technology or its new product or services to be gung ho about rolling that out. And even when they are aware that there could be risks to humans or animals or the planet as a consequence of their technology, they very rarely want it to stop altogether. They want to find safeguards that allow them to grow the industry and to exploit the technology or exploit the resources that they've discovered without too much constraint. And often, automotive's a really good example of this. There is a kind of understanding that a certain number of people will die in car accidents every year. There is a tipping point at which that's an economic acceptable position. And so we need to think about the ethics of that. And we need to remember that even when we're a little scared of some of these new technologies, AI, big data, blockchain, and what they can do, there are equally a number of people who are excited by these technologies and looking forward to them moving forward. So let's talk about Asimov's three laws because it's kind of a framework that, mind you, there was a fourth law, or well, the zeroth law, which got added later. So basically the laws are such. A robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to cause harm. That would be good, right? The second law is that a robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings, except where such an order would conflict with the first law. Fair enough. And then the third one is that a robot must protect its own existence as long as that protection doesn't conflict with laws 1 or 2. These are very similar to the ideas of what Lon Fuller, who we'll talk about in a moment, would call the principles of legality. Together, he argues these kind of rules will guarantee that all laws will embody certain moral standards of respect, fairness, and predictability constitute important aspects of the rule of law. So we've got all of those things, right? They are clear. They encompass a moral standard of respect, respect for other people, as well as respect for your stuff, the robot itself. He actually added, as I mentioned, Asimov added a fourth law. It was supposed to sit before the first law, so he called it the zeroth law. And that law was that a robot must not harm humanity as such. So not just a single individual, but it couldn't do anything that would say, for example, prevent humans from reproducing. Now, clearly, robots and artificial intelligences don't inherently contain or obey any of the three laws. They come from fiction. Human creators need to choose to program rules in and devise a mechanism for doing so. Clearly, we've had robots with us for a very long time. Many of these, so for example, one of those Roomba, vacuum cleaners that robots around your house, it's way too simple to understand when it's causing pain or injury or to know when to stop. Many artificial intelligence or robots are constructed with physical safeguards, so bumpers, warning beepers, safety cages in machines, or restricted access zones to prevent accidents. Many of them are set up so that, particularly if they have blades or machinery that works in an artificial intelligent way, it will only work if the humans are outside of the sphere. But that doesn't happen by some sort of magic. It happens because that's the way they are built and programmed. Even the most complex robots that we're producing currently, they're really not capable of understanding or applying the three laws. significant advances in artificial intelligence would be needed for them to have that kind of cognizance. Not like it could never happen. It may well happen at some point. Clearly, there's an inherent ethical complexity as well as cultural contextual dependency on the laws that will prevent them from being a great way to become design constraints. But effectively, we've got to remember these were fictional laws, and many of the stories that Asimov wrote were about circumstances where there was an ethical dilemma because the application of these rules could lead to some sort of harm or negative result. So, as the complexities of robots increase, so is interest in developing guidelines and safeguards for their operation. And often we'll start at this point because it's something that many older people already. So the other thing, I mentioned Fuller before. I just want to identify, I mentioned sort of in passing the features of a good law. Now, some of the reading on Canvas will help you go deeper into this. But I think this is a really good starting point, a kind of checklist, if you will, for us thinking about is the rule that we need to deal with when we're applying a law to something, is it a good law? So Fuller posited that all legal rules need to meet these 8 minimal conditions in order to be genuine and good laws. So they need to be sufficiently general. So rather than you must not kill somebody, it's like nobody is allowed to kill anybody. It's not just a law that is specific to you. Instead of a law that says Kath has to pay 52% of her income as tax, that's a bad law if it only applies to me. But a law generally that provides an income tax rate to everybody, that's general in its approach. It needs to be publicly promulgated. In other words, it shouldn't be a secret law. And again, in democratic countries, that has been something that we see consistently. It's very difficult to accuse somebody of breaking a law, breaching a law, if it's a secret from them. Secondly, it needs to be prospective. In other words, we don't make up laws in response to things that have happened. We anticipate things that might happen in the future or react to things that happened in the past by passing a law that will apply at a future time or in relation to activities that happen after the date of that law. It needs to be, at least minimally anyway, clear and intelligible. We need to understand it, or it needs to be capable of being understood by somebody who, in a consistent way, by people who are skilled in the art of reading laws. That'll be you soon, and it's supposed to be me. It needs to be free of contradictions. So it needs to be the law can't we can't have circumstances that apply in one place and then differently in another. So we need to see the way that the law fits together. It needs to be relatively constant. It shouldn't be changing and chopping around from day to day. It needs to be possible to obey it. And it needs to be administered in a way that doesn't widely diverge from the obvious or apparent meaning of that law. So these are the principles of legality that I mentioned a minute ago. Fuller argues that if all of these things are present, they will guarantee that all law will embody certain moral standards of respect, fairness, and predictability, which are important aspects of the rule of law. The next thing we need to think about is, so when does this happen? So laws are regularly recalibrated to respond to change. So the technologies that we are talking about in this course are disruptive, new and emerging technologies. Some of the technologies have been around for a long time. We first learnt about blockchain in 2008, for example. Artificial intelligence in one form or another has been around since Ada Lovelace 200 years ago. Algorithmic decision bots have been in active use for quite some time, but we're seeing significant changes in the technology and the applications, which mean that the ways in which these technologies are being applied and the kinds of things that they can do is changing rapidly. So ultimately, there are lots of organizations, institutions, for want of a better word, that need to respond to these changes and think about the ways that we regulate. So government, even those who are not in government but who are delivering or determining policies need to think about them. Society itself responds to them. And we've seen shifting attitudes, for example, to things like social media, something that was 20 years ago we weren't really thinking about. Local and world events and sector specific and industry specific regulation can also um, impact the way that we think about and understand how these technologies work. So in Canvas, I refer to Anthony Wong's work. He talks about sector-specific regulation, which has been adopted and adapted to address market failures or risks in critical and regulated domains. So areas like financial services, for example, or nuclear weapons. These changes have often been reactive and piecemeal with an artificial delineation of rights and responsibilities. And as a consequence, there have been a whole heap of unintended consequences. This is something that we need to really look out for when we're thinking about the ways that these kind of technologies should be regulated. We also refer to some of the work from George Borges. He says that the base tenets of our regulatory systems were created well before many of the technologies we take for granted were even thought of. And new technologies provide new opportunities, but also new risks. And regulation is important. So when it comes to regulation, one of the most important people that we will hear from along the way is this guy, Lawrence Lessig. He is an eminent scholar in this area, and he's basically been involved in internet and technology jurisprudence for more than 30 years now, and well worth following up some of his videos and the work that he does if you are interested in this kind of thing. So way back in the last millennia, Lawrence Lessig wrote a book called Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. It's an open source book. It's subsequently been updated to version 2.0. And I wouldn't be surprised with the advent of generative artificial intelligence if we don't see more of his work coming. Right back in 1999, though, Lessig was warning us that a range of decisions were being made all the time in relation to really important issues that were impacting the way that digital technologies would be used and how they would impact our society. And he challenged readers to identify the values that are driving those decisions and determine how best to address them. His theory is referred to as the pathetic dot theory. Charming, hey? And the pathetic dot is essentially us humans sitting in the middle, or the thing that we are trying to protect. It's very much aligned with the New Chicago economics theories, and it's a socio-economic theory of regulation. And ultimately, he looks at the ways that individuals, so the pathetic dots in the center, are regulated by the four forces that constrain action. He's using regulation in the broadest sense there. When we regulate, as in we narrow or define an activity. If you think about a tap or a faucet, it is there to regulate the use of water. That's to limit or to adjust the flow. And that's what regulations, when we think about them as lawyers, do. They support the legislation or the common law to provide ways of affecting the outcomes of the law. And there are four constraints. One is the market, one is architecture, so the code itself. One is society, or the norms that we expect, and the fourth one is the law itself. And each of these provide constraints that limit what it is that we can do with technology and what the outcomes could be. So let's look at the four forces in a little bit more detail. The one that you will hear in reference to Lessig's name all the time is code is law. And there he is talking about the code or the architect. So the physical or technical constraints on activities. So we might think of those as the locks on the doors or the firewalls that we have on the internet. We might think about it as the things that we code in to a particular technology to limit its use in particular circumstances. So Asimov's three laws, if they were coded in, effectively they provide that kind of architecture constraint that prevents the robots from doing the bad things to the humans. The other three markets, so the market is the economic forces and incentives. So probably a really good example of that is the Cold War, when you think that okay, might not be technically economic incentive, but the very thing that stopped, in theory, the Americans or the Russians, on the other hand, from hitting the button and creating nuclear devastation is the knowledge that if they did that, they were likely to be countered by nukes coming back from the other side. One of the things that is impacting politically decisions about whether or not NATO or other Western forces go in to assist in the Ukraine is Russia's access to nuclear weapons. So whilst there's no law that is preventing them from going and doing that, the constraint is effectively, in the broader sense, a market constraint there. Other constraints we think about when we're thinking about these kind of technologies, there's been a lot in the news recently about concerns about young people and their social media uses. So the government is talking about trialling technology that will verify the age of users before they can go onto social networks. And of course, the social networks are pushing back against this, and as are other parts of the regulatory sphere, because they're thinking, actually, how are we going to pay for this? How are we going to verify this? And what happens when we get it wrong? If we think somebody looks or feels like they're older and we let them through the door, or the other way around, when we're preventing people getting in who are old enough. And that's another version of this kind of constraint. I'll go to norms. I'll go to law last because that's really our focus in this course. But norms are the social and cultural conventions that people are compelled to follow. And we see them playing out in the ways that we use technology ourselves. We can see in the ways that we feel creeped out when the AI is a little bit too real or not quite real enough. We think about things like, again, a lot of stuff in the news recently about kids using artificial intelligence to create nudes or porn images of other children in high schools. And again, most of us find that an absolutely reprehensible outcome, and we worry very much for everybody that is involved. But we're also thinking about, well, what actually is the right thing to do when it comes to punishing children for their use of these technologies? Are the children themselves liable, or should they be held liable for what they've done? Our society tends to not like to see legal culpability at very young ages because of the impact that has on everybody's life going forward. And then we've got law, the explicit mandates that can be enforced by government. So when we have rules in the form of legislation or even case law, explicit regulation that basically says what we can and we can't do and sets the standards that we want to address. So a couple of slides here. I've been using different examples. I don't think I'll go through these, but you have a look on the slides. I am thinking about, we can see and apply this theory to, for example, NFTs, uh, which we'll talk about as we move forward and we talk a bit more about the blockchain. So thinking about the way that NFTs use the blockchain and digital certificates to verify their authenticity, that's essentially the use of the architecture, the code itself. There's no physical representation of an NFT, it's entirely in code. We've got a couple of issues that tend to come out in relation to AI in particular, and we'll be talking about these a lot, particularly when it comes to that question about, look, has the horse bolted? Is the toothpaste out of the tube? Is it too late? And clearly, the law, code, market forces, and society are all going to impact the way we think about generative AI in particular. And ultimately, over time, as things go wrong and courts need to address the things that go wrong, we'll see decision in the common law courts impacting the way that we understand the law to operate in relation to these technologies. We'll talk a little bit in the tutorial, if you need me to, about the difference between common law and judge-made law and statute-made law. But in a nutshell, the important thing for you to understand here is judge-made law is law that reacts to circumstances that are brought before it. And you'll come across a lot of examples of judge-made law, and we'll look at the ways that we can try and apply that judge-made law to these new and emerging technologies as we go forward. And then, of course, we'll also talk a lot over the course of the next 12 weeks about the regulatory challenges that lawmakers have, where the technology is developing so much faster than governments or the courts can respond. On Canvas, you'll see there's the Gutnick. Most of the cases that we've got on Canvas, we're really looking at jurisdiction in particular, but look at the way that the law in the various places, it wasn't fit for purpose when the technology changed. And we're looking at technologies that are now really passé. They're really not particularly interesting when those technologies were happening. It's interesting, we've got X and Twitter. By the way, if you're not a law student, you might not realise this. They say versus in America, but when we see that little V sign in a case name, we say and. So X and Twitter. Or more recently, actually, you might have been following in the news actions being brought by the e-safety commissioner against Twitter, or actually what is now known as X. It doesn't escape me. But effectively, these kind of questions that arise when we've got these technology companies and social media companies that are across a broad range of different jurisdictions, where we've got different laws in different places, but we're trying to protect people in a particular space. And clearly, we'll also be talking about the policy considerations as we go forward. And to a large extent, we're going to anchor this course in a company, but you will need to be thinking about, well, what are the policies of the governments around us, the governments whose laws impact the way that the company you've chosen does business, and with whose laws they need to comply. And understanding with a weather eye to what the regulatory changes might be can really help us understand what the risks are and how the legal considerations need to be thought about. And clearly these can be broad-based because technology change means changes to the way that we work, whether or not we have jobs going forward, what education looks like in the brave world, and think about the safeguards for those who have and do not have access to technology or technology literacy. So as you go forward, you'll be needing to think about, actually, do I want this regulated or not? And if I do want it regulated, do I want it regulated by law, or do I need to regulate it or limit its use in other ways? What kind of forces can we use to constrain and direct and focus these kind of technologies. Written regulation that meets those 8 principles that Lon Fuller was talking about and I was discussing earlier has the benefit of stabilising market, facilitating growth, can help with competition, but it can also restrict innovation and growth while doing so, and it can protect consumers. We've got to think about that, the potential for that limitation. And one of the things that we'll be looking at as we progress further is an alternative view, which is looking at permissionless innovation. Should we just let the market take the front step? That's something that you might have strong views on already. And then ultimately, we just keep going back to that ethics question. The ethics of emerging technologies really requires us to deal with uncertainty, to consider the consequences, the impacts, and the kinds of issues that impact the lives of the people for whom we are developing and delivering those technologies, or whose lives will be impacted by the deployment of those technologies going forward. So that's all I have to say for you right here. There's quite a lot of material that I've already recorded in relation to jurisdiction problems in the upcoming video. Sorry, there is a lot of recorded material this week. I really need to talk a lot faster or share a lot less. But between us, I'm sure we will get there. Questions, concerns, frustrations, you know where to find me.